hoping to run and read a few things from his bio, but the abstract was too long to fit a bio, I just found out. But this is, without any disrespect to the previous speakers in this seminar series, this is the best. Prashant Mehta, his PhD was in dynamical systems, analysis, applied mathematics. Not a whisper of Markovian stochastic anything. And in the last years, he realized a connection between what's called mean field games and particle filters, nonlinear filtering, and it's now has begun to create what I think will be another field. It's really very exciting. I'm very lucky to be part of this research. But without further ado, Prashant.
Well, thanks, Sean. Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I'm sure he says that every time a speaker shows up, right? But thank you. Thank you so much for your kind invitation and your kind words. So my talk will be on feedback particle filter, and this is some work that we've been doing with Sean. And today, I also have one of my students who's come along with me, Adam Tilton, who's sitting on the second row right there. And so he gets to present part of the work too, or his own work. So I'll present the first half, and then Adam will present the second part of the talk. So what I would like to do is I would like to begin with reviewing the elementary Bayes rule from your undergraduate class. I'm sure everybody has seen this. So in Bayesian problems, in Bayesian inference problems or filtering problems, there are two variables which are of interest. So one variable is the signal variable. This is hidden. It's typically denoted as x, x being something that's unknown, that you would like to infer. So the value of x is not known, but you know something about the probability distribution of x. So this is called the prior distribution. That's known. The second variable, so this is the first variable. The second variable is the observation or the measurement variable. This is typically denoted as y. The value of y is known. So that's the sensor measurement that you take. All right? The relationship between y and x, between the signal variable and the observation variable, is in terms of this something called likelihood function, which is a conditional distribution of y given x. So that you think of it as a sensor model, if you will, right, which produces outputs for given values of x. And then the problem that one is interested in is, what is the unknown x? So now, since there are probabilities in the problem, many of you are taking Professor Main's stochastic control class. So since there are probabilities in the problem, there is no unique answer to this, or the answer that makes sense is given in terms of a posterior distribution, which is conditional distribution of x given y. And Bayes' rule, which is 250 years old, tells us as to how to compute the posterior distribution in terms of likelihood function and the prior, or in terms of the problem data. So this goes back 250 years, and really the question that would be of interest, or why this problem is challenging, is really about implementing this when you have issues due to dynamics. Kalman filtering, right? By the way, I didn't ask this gentleman to bring this book, right? So, but when you have nonlinearities and you have non-Gaussian settings, right? So I'll be talking about this, but that's the basic problem. So to give you an example, I mean this is really a problem that's kind of widespread in the engineering application. Classical or sort of textbook application, if you will be, you're interested in, there's a rock falling from the skies, and you're interested in locating the location of the rock, which is unknown, right? So the location is x, you don't know what the x is, but you know something about where it started falling from, and that's the prior, and then you know something about the models. So x is a function of time. And then you have maybe a radar which tells you x, but in a noisy manner. So that's the y, that's the measurement that you take from your radar. And then the problem then is to figure out where the rock is at any particular time, given that you've seen the measurements. Since the measurements are noisy, no single measurement tells you where the state is, but over a period of time you can filter out the noise, you can reject the noise. So that's the word filtering, where filtering comes into play, to deduce the value of X. And this is important to, this is a billion-dollar industry, it's important to several applications in surveillance, radar systems. There are new applications in robotics, namely the simultaneous localization map problem, which many people in this campus are also working on, and I'm sure some of you are interested in and have been working on. The other application, more to the interest of this talk, is application to biology. So you know, this problem is kind of solved in our head, and literally solved in our head. The model that is used to describe this is called so-called Bayesian model of sensory signal processing. So what that says is, at each time you get noisy input, noisy measurements from your senses, say from your eye, and then you create a perception of where the rock is by some mechanisms that exist in your head. And you know, this goes under the name Bayesian brain. There's several sort of edited volumes that have come out in the last decade or so. So this is sort of an active field, and this is something that provides some background to this talk. So the way I've structured my talk, it's in two parts. I will talk about theory first. Namely, I'll introduce our work on feedback particle filter, which is what the title is, and then I will apply the theory to some potential applications in this arena, and then Adam will talk about some of his work related to that. All right. So let's get into the mathematical problem of nonlinear filtering. So again, as I said, any problem in nonlinear filtering comprises of two models, right? There is a signal model. So in the dynamic setting, signal X is a stochastic process, so it's a function of time, and this function evolves according to a stochastic differential equation, which you know, if you haven't seen SDEs before, then anytime you see a notation like this, you should just divide by dt on both sides, right? So if I divide by dt on both sides, then this is just dx dt, x dot is some a x of t plus, and you should think of this as noise. All right, so that's every time you want, you divide by dt, right? So second model is the observation model. So in this case, the observation model is again some noisy function of the state. So again, if you're not familiar with SDEs, then divide by dt and call that dz by dt as yt. So again, this is y at time t is some nonlinear function of state at time t plus some other noise. So these two noises are distinct, they're different. And then the problem is, what is the value of x at time t? Where is the state? Right? Given that you have made measurements from time 0 to time t. So pardon me for this notation, I didn't introduce it. But what this means is you have made observations, the history of observations from time 0 up till time t. And then the answer is given in terms of posterior distribution, which is really a conditional distribution of the state, given that you have made the measurements. And this is called the posterior distribution. The way I would like you to think about this is, posterior distribution is something that depends upon time. At each fixed time, it's just a probability density function on your state space. So if this is your state space, you know, at each fixed time, this unknown object is some density function of your state space. So I have drawn this to be a Gaussian-like function, maybe with a mean mu. So the posterior distribution is said to be information state in the sense that if you wanted to know whether the rock was between 1,000 feet and 2,000 feet, given that you have made measurements till time t, you can find it in terms of posterior distribution. It's just the area under the curve between 1,000 feet and 2,000 feet. If you want to find what the estimate is, what the best expected value of the state is, given that you made observations till time t, you just take the expected value, right? That's just the mu. So let me start with an anecdote. I gave this talk about a year ago. You know, Sean and I, we had started working on this subject, and I gave this talk in Harvard in the electrical engineering department there. And prior to the talk, I had a lunch with Professor Brockett, who used to be a faculty member there. And Roger asked me prior to my talk, this is how we started discussion. He said, "I hear that you made the particle filter pretty, right?" Now, I don't want to use this to reflect any kind of endorsement on part of Roger Brockett. And certainly the credit of this work sort of goes to Tao Yang, who has been leading this effort, who is a graduate student at University of Illinois. And the work is being done in collaboration with Professor Main, who it breaks our heart to see him move to Florida, but
He was supposed to come.
but it's great. So this sort of I thought I would include this and talk about what do you think? What do you say? What do you mean when you say something in mathematics is pretty? So there's a nice article by Kenneth Chang which appeared in New York Times. So if you Google this, you'll find it, and he went around asking mathematicians on what makes an equation beautiful. And a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for what makes something beautiful is that the result is simply stated. So a lot of people will agree that these formula are not only deep, but they're also pretty in some sense. So is there something that's pretty in filtering? Right. So thanks so much for bringing this book. Right. So again, Kalman has a history with Florida. So I hope there's not much disagreement on this point, at least, with regards to the talk. So what's a Kalman filter, right? So this is one slide description of Kalman filter. So a Kalman filter is a filter which solves the filtering problem that I described under the assumption that the model is linear. So what do I mean by model is linear? So in my model before, a of xt was a nonlinear function of the state, right? So I think of this model as a linear model when a is a linear function of the state. So a of x is just alpha times x, where alpha is a matrix. And likewise, h of x is gamma times x, where gamma is a matrix. The other problem that makes this simple is the assumption that posterior distribution is Gaussian. So linear model, Gaussian posterior distribution. So posterior distribution, which is Gaussian, is completely characterized by its mean, and by its variance, right? So it kind of looks like this. There's a mean, there's a variance, and that's completely describes the posterior distribution. So in this case, one can write a model for the filter for the evolution of the posterior distribution in terms of the evolution of the mean and the variance. So this is d by dt of x hat t is equal to alpha x hat, which is the same as this, plus some correction term. Now a heart of any filtering algorithm, like I said in my first slide, is application of Bayes' rule. So if somebody tells you, I have a filtering algorithm, you should ask them, how do you do Bayes' rule? So Kalman filter does Bayes' rule in a feedback control manner, which is sort of important to what I'm going to talk about. So let's look at it, right? So every time you make a measurement, which is yt is equal to h of xt plus noise, right? And noise is something which nature does to you. So you don't have much control over, but this is zero mean. So in an expected sense, this is zero, but it could be anything, right? So if I am a filter and I ask a microsecond before I get a measurement, before I make a measurement, if I ask, what is your best prediction of what the next observation is going to be? What's the next measurement is going to be? What would you say? The guy with the Kalman filtering book? Because this is random. This is what nature is doing to you. So you have no control over this. What you have is, in your computer, you have the estimate x hat of t. That's what you are solving for. So if I asked you, what do you think the next measurement is going to be? You're going to say, well, let me just take the expected value. So in this case, h of x, think of it as a linear function. So it's just h of x hat of t. This is stored in the computer. The computer knows this. And you know, this could be positive, negative, I mean, who knows what, 0, expected sense. So my best measurement, just before I take a measurement of what I think the next measurement is going to be, is just y, h of h, the function evaluated at the mean value that exists in my computer. Make sense? Yeah? So, all right. So then, then you make a prediction. You make a prediction, and what you do is you create an error. So again, if you're not comfortable with this notation, just divide by dt. Think of this as yt is equal to gamma xt plus noise. So your prediction y hat t is gamma x hat t. And then you use this prediction to create an error. So this is the true measurement that came in. This was what you thought the measurement is going to be. That was your best estimate of that. And this is in some sense the surprise. You know, what was revealed to you by a new measurement. Then you apply a correction here. That's really the application of Bayes' rule, as control is gain times the error. So gain times the error. That's the control that I apply. And what's the gain? The gain is the Kalman gain. So Kalman filter, right, again, really comprises of two parts. So one is the propagation part. So if you had no measurements, if you want to find out where the location of the rock is, well, you just use the signal model. So that's the signal model right here. And every time you get a measurement, you apply an update step, which is gain times an error. So gain times an error should remind you of a feedback loop. You have your measurements coming in. You create an estimate. You take a subtract, and you feed back the error, right? So you know, I teach an undergraduate class in control, and the first thing we do is we talk about proportional integral control, right? You know, all of you have done this when you took your undergraduate class, right? And everybody sort of understands this, transfer functions, so on and so forth. And then, as an example, I introduce a Kalman filter in the undergraduate class, right? So these are kids who haven't taken probability theory, you know, much less stochastic processes, but everybody understands the magic of feedback, because this really illustrates to me two key principles of feedback control, one of which is you use error to drive your control. So your control is gain times the error. And then the second one is that if you have high gain feedback, that will cause the error to reduce. So you'll be able to do prediction well. That's what you're after. And then the Kalman gain has some nice intuitive feature to this. So it's pretty simply stated, easy to describe, even in undergraduate class, right? It's elementary feedback control theory. Now, if you change the problem somewhat, if you make your functions a and h to be nonlinear, this beauty or this simplicity sort of goes away in some sense. The solution is given by a solution of a stochastic partial differential equation. This is really not the intent of my talk, and I don't want to get into this. There are notions of innovation, error, feedback that you can look at it at stochastic PDE, but it's a nonlinear PDE. It's hard to solve, and these problems are generally believed to be quite tough. By the way, these kinds of solutions go back 50 years, so you know the field is as old as bread pudding, right? All right, so these things are hard to solve. And over the last 20 years, there has been a lot of development in numerical methods to solve these equations. And these numerical methods are simulation-based methods, and they go under the name of particle filtering. So again, what was the objective of filtering? For the kids who are not sleeping, the objective of filtering was to find the posterior distribution. You know, you're after the posterior distribution, right? It looks like a probability density function on the state space. So what these methods do is they represent the posterior distribution in terms of particles. So this is my density that I'm trying to represent in terms of particles. Well, I have lots of particles here and very few particles here. So if I do a histogram of these particles, the histogram will look like that. That's what it is saying. So xit is the state of the ith particle at time t. And then there are n of them, n being very, very large. So you're sampling from the distribution. So a typical algorithm is described in discrete time. So one begins with an initialization step. So you are given a prior distribution. This is where you think the rock started, between 1,000 and 2000 feet. So you sample particles from that distribution, and at each discrete time step, when you get an observation, so you get an observation y is equal to x plus small noise, and then your measurement was right here in the red, at the red dot. So what does that tell me? That tells me that the state is somewhere close by, because my noise is extremely small, you see. So my state is somewhere nearby. So the method, what it does is, it's a Bayesian update step, also referred to as importance sampling. What it does is increases the likelihood of these particles. So these are the weights on these particles. They increase, and it decreases the likelihood of the particles which are far away. All right. So this, in some sense, gives you a distribution which is kind of quite coarse. You have 4 particles which have very, very high weight. You have lots of particles which have small weight. So what you do is you do a resampling step. So these guys are strong and mighty guys, so they get to reproduce, right? In a sexual or asexual manner, as the case may be. So they reproduce a lot of children, while these particles are weak guys, right? They have small weight, so some of them get killed. So these are algorithms also called survival of the fittest. So you resample from a distribution, and then you get something which is smooth. And then you repeat the procedure again and again and again in a recursive fashion. So it's a Bayesian step, which is called importance sampling, and a resampling step which does this. So this is an interesting procedure. I mean, it's a simulation-based method. When I talked about Kalman filter, I talked about creating errors, right? Making predictions, creating innovation errors, feedback. There's nothing like that here, or nothing like that here, at least in an explicit fashion, right? But more importantly, in my eye, right, and this is why we do science, right? This and the other reason is money. So more importantly, is this pretty, right? And so the goal of research is to, right? You guys are pretty passive, yeah. And this is something we call as feedback particle filter, and that's what I'll describe now. So we take a different approach to particle filtering. So again, the problem is, the problem of nonlinear filtering is, I have 2 models. I have a stochastic differential equation for the state process that I'm trying to estimate, and then I have noisy observations. A and H are nonlinear functions of state, and I would like to find the posterior distribution, right? That's the problem. So again, I think of n particles. If I had no measurements coming in, then what I would do is I would use basically the signal model, lots and lots of them, to cover the distribution, right? Large number of them. BITs are independent Wiener processes, independent white noise processes, right? So it's the same, many copies of this model. So what are these classes of algorithms called? For the folks who are taking Professor Main's class, this class of algorithm are called Monte Carlo algorithm, right? This is a way to represent the distribution in a Monte Carlo way. You have many samples, and then you run them independently, all right? Now, if you have measurements coming in, then what we want to do is we want to apply control on the right-hand side. We would like to apply the control to do what? Well, to minimize a divergence between, or minimize the distance between the posterior distribution, that's the posterior distribution that I'm trying to calculate, and then the empirical distribution of the population. All right, that's a distribution that I have in terms of particles. All right, so every time I want to nudge the particle, I want to apply control to the particles so that they solve the particle filtering problem. So they reproduce the distribution which is as close as possible to the posterior distribution. All right. And then the first papers are, as I said, are by Yang, Mehta, and Mein. And I will not talk about the theory of this. Certainly, the theory can be found in papers, and we certainly defeat the purpose of my talk to bring the pretty back, right? It's not pretty. The calculations are not pretty, so I decided to exclude it from this talk. But the answer that you get is. I'll let you judge. Maybe it's pretty. So what did I say? Anytime somebody gives you a nonlinear filtering algorithm, what do you ask them? How do you do? Bayes rule. How do you do Bayes rule, right? Because it's ultimately about Bayes rule. That was my first slide. So how do we do Bayes rule, right? How do we do Bayes rule? I mean, this is how Kalman did Bayes rule. He made the prediction and created an error, and that gain feedback it to apply the correction. So how do you do Bayes rule with particles, right? So it's the same model, y is equal to hx plus noise. That's the same model. In the linear case, the h of x is a linear function of state. All right? And now I have many particles. Many particles, lot of them. I goes from 1 through n. Large number of particles. Now if I went and asked the ith particle, you know, a microsecond before I make the measurement, if I went and asked the ith particle, what do you think? What do you think the next observation is going to be? What do you think? Siddharth? Right now. So it's the ith particle, x of it. It knows its state, right? It knows its state. So if I went and asked the ith particle, what do you think the next measurement is going to be? Well, you know, I know my state, right? I know my state. So depends upon how narcissistic the particle is. So let's imagine it's a narcissistic particle, right? So what do you think a narcissistic particle would say? So a narcissistic particle by definition is right, right? Always right. He knows the truth. He or she knows the truth, right? So what's it going to say? That's the state of the ith particle. That's the model. This is something that nature does. Even the narcissistic guy admits that he has no control over this. It knows truth. Well, h of xi of t, right? Because it's a narcissistic particle. You know, so it knows where the state is. To hell with the rest. H of xit, right? Now if I ask the population, right? So this was the ith particle. If I ask the whole population, what do you think the state is going to be? Anybody? Maybe majority, yeah. I mean, that's, you know, that's a good answer. I mean, that would be a mode. Maybe that's. So my answer is, well, democracy, I believe in that, right? So let's take prediction of every guy and average it. Right? So that's ith guy's prediction. That's the jth guy's prediction. I just average it. Right? So what is this called? The mean at time t. That's my mean prediction. Right? So think about it like this. You want to go and buy a stock, right? And you have your valuation of a stock. That's your personal valuation of stock. You are the ith particle. That's your personal valuation of stock. That's h of xit. What is this? That's the Dow price. Dow price is an average of everybody's valuation of a stock. Right? That's the Dow price. Now if you want to buy a stock, if you're a narcissistic particle, then you will base your decision just on what your personal valuation of a stock is. But even the most narcissistic person among us will say, man, maybe I'll look at the market. Maybe I'll see what the Dow is telling me. So what do? You guys are very passive. What do? You wait. You hedge, right? You wait or you hedge. You know, you say, maybe these guys, a lot of them know something that I don't, so I'll hedge. So if I hedge, then I add this to this, right? This to this, and divide by 2. Right? Add the two numbers, divide by 2. Right? So it turns out, and this is what theory tells us, the right thing to do for the ith particle prediction is h of xit, so that's the narcissistic part in the ith particle, hedged with what the population is saying, divide by 2. All right? So then the ith particle creates an error, you know, how badly it did, which is the measurement that you get minus its own prediction, and gain feeds back it. So somebody knows what this circle is? All right, so that's something for you guys to do, homework problem, right? Figure out what that circle is. But it's gain times the error for the ith guy, all right? And then the question is, what is the gain? Well, in the linear case, the gain is the Kalman gain. You know, it is same as the Kalman gain out here. And in the nonlinear case, the gain is solution of some linear boundary value problem. So what is this? Well, I will not get into the technicalities of what this boundary value problem is, but think about it like this. So everybody applies a control. Everybody applies a control which does the Bayesian update step, which is gain times the error. And then this gain in the linear case is no matter where you are in the state space, you apply the same gain. That gain is the Kalman gain. That's the constant Kalman gain. If it's a nonlinear case, then your gain depends upon where you are in some sense. So, you know, it's some nonlinear function of the state. The nonlinear function of the state is a solution to some problem that you must solve at each time. This solution is difficult to obtain, but if I asked you, well, what is the line that runs through this? What is the average? Then you can write that in closed form formulas. So you can approximate that function very, very efficiently using closed form formulas. I mean, that's the big takeaway. All right. So control type methods, you know, one of the things that they give you, you know, if you ever worked on controlling an unstable system, for example, right? You know, controlling a pendulum, which is, you know, making the pendulum upright, right? Inverted pendulum upright. You need feedback, right? So feedback can help you with the variance issues that arises in the simulation-based method. So here is one plot of that, which shows that, you know, for a given number of particles, you get order of magnitude improvement in the variance than for simulation-based methods by using feedback, the magic of feedback, right? So, but really and there are tons of applications, papers, so on and so forth, that you can read on my website or folks who are working on these kinds of things. But really the main takeaway that I would like you to do is Kalman filter. When you think about it, it is really a feedback loop. You create an error which is output minus the prediction. And then the second thing to remember is then you gain feedback it. Gain is the Kalman gain. Feedback particle filter is the same feedback loop at the level of the ith particle. So you create a prediction between the actual measurement and then the hedge, and then you gain feedback it. And gain is some solution of a linear boundary value problem. That's the only thing, you know, even the folks who have fallen asleep, just woken up, remember these two, right? That's about it. So the next thing would be sort of more exploratory. Any questions? Yeah.
Would it make any difference to essentially change the weights between the narcissistic particle and the consensus of particles? Right now it's essentially 0.5
yeah.
on each of them. What if you give more weight to the particle or to the consensus?
Yeah, that's a great question. But the discussion of that is best done over scotch, right? Because the answers are more philosophical than anything else. But as it turns out, from a theoretical perspective, half and half is the only thing that works. All right. So if I was to go and say, you know, I change the weight, maybe 0.75 and 0.25, then you don't get the right answer. You see. So half and half is the thing that works, right? Provably that works, and the other things don't. Now, if you don't trust the measurement, if you get a measurement and you really don't trust the measurement, maybe it's a false alarm, then this story becomes different. All right, but that's the thread I would not get into right now. So this is really the source of why we started thinking about these problems, this is related to issues with the so-called neural rhythm. So let me start describing that. And this part will be slightly at a faster pace than the other part, but I'll try to provide more motivation to folks who don't have intimate familiarity with this. So the starting point of this are such models. Somebody know a name for this model, for this nonlinear differential equation? Don't be shy. So this is called a Hodgkin-Huxley model of a neuron. V is the voltage parameter, and H and R are so-called gating variables. What these models are useful for modeling dynamics of a single neuron. So everybody has sort of seen this neural spike train, right? You see it on oscilloscope. in your favorite movie or TV serial or whatever. So what neurons do is they do this, they spike, tuck, 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 as a function of time. So this is time, and then this is voltage. And then if you take this model and you simulate it as a function of time, then what you get is you get this limit cycles in the phase space. So V is the voltage right here, H and R are these other states, and this is just a limit cycling solution. So it's a periodic orbit solution. So since the motion is sort of periodic, there exists a reduction procedure whereby what you do is you parameterize the orbit around the limit cycle by this variable called a theta variable. This is called the phase variable, so that the motion along the limit cycle is really a motion along the phase of the oscillator. And then there's a natural frequency, so this says that theta dot is equal to omega plus some coupling which comes from other neurons, right? So here, if you haven't seen this, the takeaway message is that there is a way to model a periodic activity, a periodic firing of a single neuron by these oscillator models. Now this oscillator model, a single oscillator model, is not very useful because you have abstracted all the behavior, dynamic richness of a single neuron, or a Hodgkin-Huxley model. But where it is useful is in the study of large collection of oscillators. So large collection of oscillators would be the audience in the room oscillating, they're clapping. So the collective behavior that emerges when a lot of people are periodic orbits themselves, they're connected with each other, these classes of models are very useful. And then there is a TED lecture, by the way, if you haven't seen this kinds of stuff, by Steve Strogatz, who is a professor in Cornell, and he has a wonderful book called Sync also, which speaks to this question. And then whether any of this is relevant to actually what goes on in brain is a matter of huge conjecture, but certainly there is something called neural rhythms in the brain, and you can look at a book by Butsaki, who's a genuine neuroscientist in this regard, right? The question as with many problems in neuroscience, question is, well, okay, so you can build models and you can show some kind of a collective behavior, maybe synchronization, but is this useful in any ways? Is there a functional role to this? And people over the years this is an active debate as far as I know. I'm not a neuroscientist, but as far as my own reading of literature and talking to people is concerned, this is an active debate, and there are buzzwords that go like neurons that fire together, wire together. So this is implicated in synaptic plasticity, which is related to learning. When your brain goes to sleep, then certain parts of the brain tend to synchronize. So it's related to sort of sleep wakefulness, and as some of us know, maybe even diseased brain states related to epileptic seizures and such, right? By the way, I have a conjecture that mind of geniuses tend to synchronize more than the other ones. So one man's disease might be other man's creativity, but in any case, that's another discussion, right? And then there are many number of review papers in this regard that you can look at. But really, as far as role in computation, I think that remains an open question. And one way to think about this question is through the lens of Bayesian inference. So here is so there's there is a community of people out there who think along these lines. So here are a couple of quotes from Jeff Hawkins, who's written a book called On Intelligence. Jeff Hawkins is an AI person, he's a computer scientist, and this is a quote I've taken from his book. It says, "Prediction is the primary function of the neocortex. Intelligent machines, then you should understand this." This is Rodolfo Linas's book, Eye of the Vortex. It's a very readable book, beautiful book. If you're looking for suggestions during your winter break, might be something to look at. And this is a quote from his book: "Capacity to predict the outcome of future events is most likely the ultimate and most common of all functions." So Bayesian inference, I don't say this, right? I mean, these are people who genuinely have spent lifetimes studying these things. These are their quotes. And certainly there is something called a Bayesian model of sensory signal processing, which kind of makes sense, right? If you use radars to track objects in the sky, falling rocks, then it kind of makes sense that you get noisy input from senses, and then you must be doing some kind of signal processing to process that. And then there are a number of theoretical investigations in this area. This is David Mumford from Brown. There are a couple of couple of edited volumes on this subject, and some of these names, this is a much larger list. And then certainly there are experiments involving primates where you have a monkey do some task with regard to perception, and then there are some review articles with regards to that. And then such theories sort of naturally feed into computer vision, which is another big field that I know little about. And then generally into how to make computer intelligent, which becomes much more speculative in many ways. So certainly I cannot cover that, but some background. So what I'll do is to make things concretely, I will talk about Lee and Mumford's paper. So this is a paper which appeared in, I should have the proper reference, but it appeared in early 2000, and they talk about the so-called hierarchical Bayesian inference framework. So what I have is, I have here a visual hierarchy. So think about this box as some small tiny part of the visual cortex in the brain, some small part of your brain. So this part of the brain receives input from eye. So think about this as input that is coming from the retina. And then it receives some feedback from higher regions, higher cortical regions in the brain. So this is in particular in their paper is the V1 region of the visual cortex. And they, in their framework that they postulate in the paper, they say, well, V1 is tasked by computing some feature of the visual landscape. Let's call it X1, right? V1 computes X1. I mean, they don't provide more detail on what that X1 might be. But let's say it computes something about whether Sean Main is sitting in the audience or not, right? So that's maybe X1. So since there's noisy input coming in, that X1 is computed in terms of Bayes rule. That's what they say in the paper. That's the framework that they want. And so each region does Bayes rule, and then there's some sort of a hierarchy which is built in. So the question is Bayes rule is 250 years old. The question is, how do you implement Bayes rule, right? So the implementation of the Bayes rule, they say, well, there are lots of neurons in any region of the brain. So particle filter is a way which has many particles. So maybe they postulate in the paper that the Bayes rule is implemented in terms of a particle filter. And then there are sort of various versions of this, sort of similar schematic. So Rao has written a lot of papers in this area, something called predictive coding framework, where the particle filter is replaced by Kalman filter, right? So, and then there are sort of related works. So this brings me to the application part of this talk, which is really to apply feedback particle filter to think about neural rhythms and such, right? And as with everything else, these things are very speculative. But the underlying math is interesting, and the application may also be compelling. So this is really Adam Tilton's work, who worked with Professor Lizau Wexler and also, of course, with Professor Main on some applications related to ankle-foot orthoses. So at this point of time, I'll invite Adam to come, and then we can take some questions jointly together.
Should I take the mic?
Yeah.
So as Professor Mehta said, this is my work with collaboration with Lizau Wexler, Sean Mine, Professor Mehta, and I'm going to talk about ankle-foot orthoses. So what I'd like to do in this talk is relate filtering with oscillators to a physical application. And that application is going to be the human gait cycle. So what I'll describe is how we model the gait cycle as an oscillator, the observations that we get, and then I'll apply the filter. So ankle-foot orthoses are for lower limb neuromuscular impairments. So these are devices that assist somebody who has a problem with plantiflexing, which is pushing down with their toes, or dorsiflexing, which is pulling up. So the way it does that is it has a rotary actuator here, and then there are pressure sensors on the bottom of the foot, and we would like to use those pressure sensors to estimate the state so that the rotary actuator can actuate at the appropriate times. So my model for so I need a signal. In a filtering problem, I need both a signal and an observation process. So I'm going to model my signal, but first I'd like to describe what the signal is. So this gait cycle is broken up into two parts, the stance phase and the swing phase, and it begins with heel contact, and then it traverses along the gait cycle until the subsequent contact of the same foot. So that's my periodic process. And I will now introduce a noisy oscillator model. And what this does is it reduces the complexity of the problem to simple oscillators on circles. So now I can discuss the filtering problem by talking about models that live on the circle. So also for my filtering problem, I need an observation. So those observations come, again, from pressure sensors, which are on the bottom of the foot. And I have a model for my pressure sensors given here, and they look like what is described in this image. So these red dots are 20 cycles of observation data overlaid on 0 to 2 pi. So the red dots come from the actual pressure sensors on the bottom of the foot. And I'll now introduce a step function as my observation model. So dz here is the observation, h is going to be the step function, and then this defines my observation model. And there are two important things I'd like to point out about this model. The first is going to be the toe strike. So that's listed here, and that's when the person steps on the pressure sensor. So the data goes from low to high. And then there's toe off, and so that would be when the individual enters into their swing phase. So their toe leaves the ground. And that portion of the circle is defined here, right? So that's the part of the gait cycle where the individual is stepping on their toe and then lifting off their toe. So the question now is, what is theta t given these noisy observations? So if all I know is the pressure sensor data, what is the person's gait cycle value? That's the question I would like to address. So you have a hidden gait cycle, noisy observations. We'd like to construct a large number of oscillators, an oscillator circuit. And we'd like that circuit to answer questions like, where is the individual in their gait cycle, which of course is given by the posterior distribution. So what the posterior distribution tells me is, what is the probability of theta being between phi 1 and phi 2? Well, according to this graphic, the probability is very low, right? It's more likely that the state is over here. And that is determined simply by the fraction of my particles that are in a given interval. So if I know where the particles are, I can answer this question. And now I construct this circuit according to the methodology given to us by the feedback particle filter, where I would like to design this control term. So this control term will be how I implement the FPF. So again, I have a signal and an observation, where my observation is a step function. This is the toe sensor. I have particles, which are defined according to this equation, so I have many of them. So this is a large number of particles. And each individual particle is spinning with its own frequency, omega I. So I draw these omega I's from a distribution. So I have fast spinning particles, and I have slow spinning particles. And then the mass of these particle circuits is going to influence the individuals through this feedback loop, where I will apply the feedback particle filter. OK, so now to talk more about the results, let me introduce this video. So before I play it, I'll give you a couple of notes. So Liz Shaw-Wexler has a lab where she studies human motion, and she's building these ankle-foot orthoses devices. And so she instruments an individual who's walking on a treadmill. And she instruments them not only with the pressure sensors on the bottom of the foot, but with motion capture sensors along their body. And those motion capture sensors provide for us the ground truth. So that's here. So the green and the orange leg correspond. I've animated the motion capture markers, so you'll be able to see the individual walking. And on their instrumented leg, here the orange leg, they're wearing a heel sensor and a toe sensor. And that data is going to be displayed here. And it is the pressure sensor data that I'm going to feed into the particle filter to do the estimation problem. So you'll see the time series of pressure sensor data evolving here. I send that over to my feedback particle filter, and that gives me an estimate. And then I, just for visual purposes, I find the closest set of motion capture data that corresponds to my estimated mean. And then I plot that data as well as my dashed gray lines here. So I have an individual walking with motion capture data. They have pressure sensors on their foot. The pressure sensors are sent to the feedback particle filter, which gives me an estimate, and then I can compare the motion capture data back again. And here I'm going to start with a uniform distribution of particles around the circle. So I have no prior knowledge of where my state is. So as my individual starts walking, they step on their heel. Pressure sensor data goes high. They step off their heel and onto their toe, and then they step off their toe. In the swing phase, I have no information, so diffusion occurs. My slow particles slow down, my fast particles speed up. Again, my person steps on their heel, I get information. They'll step off their heel, they synchronize on their toe, off their toe. So my particles now synchronize using the pressure sensor data on the bottom of the foot. I can find the mean, the expected value. Right, I can integrate my posterior distribution. And then here, these gray lines that are twitching back and forth, That's the set of motion capture data that most closely corresponds to my expected value. Are there questions about this video? Or about the... Okay. So, all right. So as Professor Mehta mentioned, this has some connection to Liam Mumford's work, where it is possible that a particle filter could be sitting here. You get these noisy inputs. Maybe it's pressure data, and then you're allowed to, and then you can compute these prior distributions of particles. And so, here is our hidden system from which we're getting these noisy inputs. We create the structure of oscillators, and then from that we can determine an estimate of where the individual is within their gait cycle. Okay, so I think that's the application. Thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Professor Mehta for questions.
How big is your estimation error?
So we list those errors in the paper. So if you want the numbers, you can look it up. We did this for 5 different individuals. I think each one walked for 30 seconds on the treadmill. We computed it over, I think, 20 cycles. And then we had one individual who had an impairment in their ability to walk. And so we also have results for them. And that's in the ACC paper 2012 with Liz Schau-Wexler.
Can you give ballpark estimates?
I can't. No, not.
5%, 10%?
Yeah, 5%ish. Yeah, not very much. They were pretty good. As you saw in the video, I mean, the estimates were pretty close to what we'd expect. And of course, we could improve this methodology as well. Good question. Thank you.